before the meeting ends, the feed will be restored. We have no apologies. Before we move on to formal business of the meeting, I'd like to take a moment for us to pay tribute to Stuart Fulton, who died recently. As many of you will know, Stuart led the forerunner to the Cairngorms National Park Authority. He was Chief Executive Officer of the Cairngorms Partnership, based here in Granton. And for those of you who didn't know Stuart, he had a reputation as a strong character and a strong champion of community leadership and partnership working. He laid the foundations that we're building on today. I'm sure everyone will join me in sending our condolences to Stuart's family and friends. To item 2 minutes of today's meeting, 2 minutes from or held on November the 24th. Are there any points of accuracy on the minutes? Before I take any points, I have two. Derek Ross and Steve Micklewright should be shown as present. Are there any other points of accuracy? None. Thank you very much. We'll take that as an accurate record. Item 3, matters arising not covered elsewhere. Actions. So from the draft minutes, 24th of November, paper 1, Chief Executive Report at paragraph 10, the CEO to write to farmers and put on the National Park website information on grant assistance for flood banks in the Cairngorms National Park. That's completed. The CEO and officers to meet with farmers and crofters to answer outstanding questions, completed. From the draft minutes for September the 8th, paper 2, National Park Partnership Plan Annual Update at paragraph 14, the CEO confirmed that we will speak with Cairngorms Business Partnership and discuss their long-term plans and come back to the board with an update. That's completed, and there will be an update in the CEO report. Paper 4, Capercaillie Conservation at paragraph 21, strategic aspects of the plan to come back to the board for approval and to performance committees for regular updates. That's in hand. From the draft minutes, October the 27th, paper 1, tackling the nature emergency. At paragraph 32, the CEO to add to the Park Authority's response to the consultation that the board would like to see further wording on people and place, completed. The CEO to seek clarification from the Scottish Government on the wording of public bodies and questions 7G and 7H, and inform the board in November, in hand. Are there any other matters arising not covered elsewhere? None. Thank you very much, boards. Item 4, declarations of interest. So none have been received in advance, but I do have a statement regarding item 5, paper 1, the CEO report and convener update, and item 6, paper 2, the budget for 2024-25 and the operational plan. And members, please bear with me on this, but it will save time. Just a short explanation. So these are wide-ranging papers covering all aspects of the board's range of activities. Discussion on these papers is expected to be at a high level around members seeking assurance of the balance of investment being made to deliver the agreed corporate objectives set out in the paper. So members' existing declarations in the Register of Interests are regarded as being appropriate disclosures for discussion of the paper. No statements of interest are required for transparency unless there are connections in the paper to matters not already disclosed in the Register of Interests. If on an exceptional basis, discussion of these papers becomes focused on specific investments or details of activities, members may wish to make declarations at that point and withdraw if it's appropriate to do so. Are we clear on all of that? So thanks very much. All of that said, are there any other declarations of interest? None, thank you. Moving on to papers, item 5, paper 1, the CEO report and convener update. So this is for information and for board members to ask questions. I'll now ask Chief Executive Officer Grant Moore to introduce this report. Grant.
Yep. Morning, everyone. Yes, it's been a busy 3 or 4 months since the last meeting. Just want to highlight a couple of things that happened nationally. First of all, which was that yesterday the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Bill was passed in the Scottish Parliament. So that will come into effect in due course. There's quite a lot in that in terms of the provisions and the amendments that were passed as well. So we're still looking at all of that, but that is around the grouse moor licensing. It's around Muirburn licensing. It's around snares and things like that. So we'll do a synopsis for members. We'll put that around next week once we've had a chance to digest it all and get it into. The bill is quite long, so we'll try and digest that down into a 1 or 2 pager that people can get their heads around. The key things for us are around the Muirburn licensing and around the burning on peatland. Colin McLean, our head of land management, is on the working group around that, and I think it met yesterday actually to discuss the next steps around that. So there'll be dates coming up when these different bits of the legislation are implemented, but we'll let members know in due course. So that's the one that's just been passed. And then the other bill that's just been introduced into the Scottish Parliament is the Land Reform Bill. You remember we put in our response to that about a year ago, I think, probably now, in terms of the consultation around that. There's some pretty key things in there that we're going through its parliamentary journey, so we're still going to go through all its stages, but measures that will apply to large land holdings over 1,000 hectares, prohibiting sales in certain cases until ministers can consider the impact on the local community. This could lead to some land holdings being lotted into smaller parts, if that may help communities. The bill also places legal responsibilities on the owners of largest land holdings to show how they use their land and how they contribute to key public policy priorities, and that's through land management plans. There's also in there a model to publish a new land management tenancy, and there's reform to tenant farming and small holdings legislation in there as well. So there's quite a lot of things in that bill as well. Again, we'll send around a short synopsis with the key things that are within that. The key point for us, which we'll be making some representations to the Scottish Government on, is that we asked in our response that the land management plans within the National Park linked up into the National Park Partnership Plan. It doesn't have that at the moment in the legislation, which is a bit disappointing, and it was made by quite a number of different organisations as well. So we'll look to see what we can do to try and see if we can get that changed, because it seems strange that you've got a statutory management plan for the National Park that's approved by ministers, but you wouldn't have the land management plans linked to those. You'd have them linked to some national legislation. So there's a bit of work to be done for us there in terms of the land reform bill, and no doubt it will it'll wind its course through the Parliament over the next while in the different stages, and we'll see what happens with amendments and such like as that progresses. So that's just 2 bits at the national level. And I said I would give a quick update on from the matters arising around the Cairngorms Business Partnership. So just to give that, which is that Craig, who's their new Chief Executive, who started in January, is preparing a new business plan for the business partnership, and then we'll be producing an operational marketing plan post that when that's been agreed with the board. They are looking to grow their membership, as you expect, and they're going to be doing some extra work around that in terms of making sure that they retain their current members and look at how they can expand into new members. They'll be doing more work on educational signposting as well to visitors around I suppose behaviours within the national park and what's the expectation around that. So that's some key things, but they're trying to keep the same tone of voice that they've used in terms of their previous work. And they're looking to do a bit more work on collaborating with other businesses or other organisations in the business advice area so that they're all aligned. So I think they're talking to GrowBiz and some of the other business development groups to ensure that work is aligned, and they're going to be doing some further work, I think, with the other DMOs that cover the park. So that's the Murray Speyside and Visit Aberdeenshire as well, to make sure that there's no confusion or duplication between some of those bits of work. So that's their package. So let's just give a quick update on that. And then in terms of the CEO report, just a couple of bits to highlight. One is that the seasonal rangers are with us. Obviously Easter is quite early this year. It's very early, it's in March. So that's been quick. So we're quite early this year in terms of that side of things, but we're all in place for the coming season. We're still advertising for a couple of posts on D-side where we were unsuccessful the last time in recruiting. So that's out at the moment, but we're hopeful to fill those very shortly. The other part was just to flag to people on the fire bylaw consultation, we've had 571 responses so far, with about a month to go. There is the Cairn magazine is going out to everyone. I think it's gone out, it's about to go out next week, and that has a link and a QR code for people to then go to the website, and then there'll be a door drop with about a week to go to everyone as well within the park to get that. So I suspect I don't know how we will end up with, but I suspect it'll be around about 1,000, would be my guess, was where we'll end up in terms of the fire bylaw. And we've been going out and speaking to lots of different people. We've been at a number of community councils across the park as well, speaking to people and hearing views. So it's been really good so far in terms of that in-depth side of things. And then the other part was just to flag up on the, try to find where it is, but the volunteer rangers. We've had training for the next batch of volunteer rangers, so I think it's 26. That takes us up to about 86 in total across the national park. We've got a good representation across the park. Lots of residents came forward, and we've also got this time, we targeted more people in the south of the park as well, because that's where we were slightly light, and we've got quite a few people from the Perth and Ross area into that bit. So we've got a good balance across the whole national park in terms of the volunteer rangers. And then the final bit that I just want to flag up was that you will have seen some of this, but there's been quite a lot of misinformation being peddled in certain quarters around national parks in general, but some of the stuff said about the Cairngorms National Park. We've been doing a lot of media comms, blogs, interviews to combat that and try and get out the facts and figures and the reality of what the national park does and what the national park doesn't do. As I all said, there's a good debate to be had about national parks and about whether other places should be national parks, but that needs to be based on facts and figures and reality and what it can and can't do. And some of that hasn't been the case. So we've been trying to make sure we're being pretty strong on that in terms of our pieces around that. And then happy to take anything else within the report. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Grant. Before I invite questions on the report, I would like to ask Deputy Convener Ellen McIntosh to give us a brief update on a very, very significant communities event which happened just too late to be included in the formal report to board. Eleanor.
Yeah, okay. Some board members were also at the event in Botagarten last Friday on Hannah, Kenny, myself, who am I missing, and Fiona. I think that was us. So this is an event organised by some of Murray's team to bring the communities across the park together to see what the way forward should be for how they communicate with us and the park communicate back to the communities. In the prior to COVID, we had a quite active association of Cairngorm community councils, but for various reasons, it has now decided to fold, mainly because it was too onerous a take on for the people involved who weren't getting any younger. So we had a good turnout. There was over 40 folk there from absolutely every corner of the park. It was very upbeat. They were all enthusiastic. We had 2 workshop sessions. The first one on the challenges and successes that communities were having. And the second one was based on how they wanted any future meetings to what shape they wanted to take. And there was no decision taken at that meeting, but there's a lot of feedback. And I know Fiona McNally, who was leading it, helped by Karen Derrick from VABS, will be going through that feedback and, working out what is the best way. They were very up for some sort of forum, maybe twice a year, something like that, with a sort of learning aspect to it, somewhere where they could meet, discuss issues, successes, a bit like what happened on the Friday, and where we the park had a chance to speak to them, and they could take their chance to speak to us. Just as a follow-up to that, on the Friday, there was an online catch-up meeting with anybody who didn't make the Friday on the Tuesday evening. There was about 10 folk came along to that online. And again, it went very much the same way as the Friday had gone. So, Murray, I don't know if I've missed anything there or if there's a time scale for feeding back to communities.
No, I think you've summarised it very well. We're working on the report, which will give a high-level summary of what everyone was saying. I mean, I think, as you said, there was a positive atmosphere towards the end, but I think I would stress that many of the communities talked about just how difficult it was to keep things going in their own local areas, because they are seeing quite a change in people's availability to volunteer for things and willingness to step forward. And therefore, the prospect of doing something more at a part-wide level was challenging for them, because they're very, very busy already. But we'll get the report out within the next 2 weeks, and then we'll have to have further dialogue with the community leaders to work out what next to do. But there's huge opportunities because of the resources now available through the Cairngorms 2030 programme.
Yeah, I think you added quite a significant bit there about the challenges that communities do face. Are the other board members that were there, are they happy with that as a summary? Yeah. Okay.
Hey, thanks, Eleanor, and thanks for stepping into the breach to chair those meetings while I was recovering from COVID. I'm very grateful. Just on that last point, on behalf of the board, I'd like to recognise the commitment of all those community of representatives from right across the park who gathered at Botegarten for that meeting and who took part in the follow-up online session. I mean, we really do fantastic things when we work together. All that said, any questions on the CEO report? And I can now confirm we are being live streamed.
Just for your
no, thank you very much for that. Yeah, really a good CEO report. Good to see all the progress that's being made. I have a question on item 31. The values and culture work which is going on within the organisation. I'm really pleased to see that. I think it's incredibly important that that work is undertaken within the organisation. My question is about the board's involvement in that. I think it's absolutely crucial that the board have some involvement in that, because we need to represent those values and those behaviours as well, and we need to buy into it. So in order to do that, we need to be part of that process. I just wondered when that was going to take place. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Fiona. Can pick that one up. We're taking forward a piece of work at the moment and bringing in some facilitators to help us just finish off this piece of work and looking at our values and cultures from a staff-led position. This is a bit of work that's flowing from the staff gathering that we had at the end of October. The process will flow through, there'll be papers and reports going, first of all, to the Resources Committee, as looking at the piece of work that we've been doing through values and cultures, and also the wider piece of work that Kate Christie's doing at the moment on our organisational development strategy and the refresh of the organisational development strategy. I would imagine once it's gone through that Resources Committee, then sometime by potentially the June board, if not then the September one, would be kind of bringing the organisational development strategy and the values and cultures piece within that back up to the board at that stage to give an overview.
I was thinking not just to be given an overview, to actually be involved in the process. My experience is that when values and cultures are being developed like that at some point the board have an opportunity to actually get some involvement in it and contribute in some way.
Yep, and that's a very fair point. I think that's one of the kind of touch points we'll have with the Resources Committee about where we might draw in some informal discussion between the Resources Committee, discussion of the processes that have been going along, and how we might design in some informal discussion with the full board before coming back to the board, as I say, probably around about September time with a fuller strategy piece through the organisational development strategy. But it's a fair point, and I'll make sure that we're kind of winding that into our timetables.
Thank you very much. We have questions from Lauren McCallum, followed by Pete Cosgrove.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I have got a question about the Integrated Fire Management Plan. Myself and Grant were present at the Aviemore Community Council last Thursday, and Police Scotland gave a pretty stark update on police numbers locally, and just in terms of the fire management plan and being able to work with police, especially down at Glenmore this year, have we had discussions about that extra police patrols and if they'll be able to facilitate them this year? Because it was a pretty stark update on police numbers locally.
Yeah, so I mean, we've had conversations with Police Scotland, and we'll be looking to pay for extra police presence in the area again this coming year. So that's in the plans. We're just discussing with them. They need to make it slightly more flexible. If you remember last year, we had in advance sort of aid to try and ensure that we had extra police on weekends during the school holidays. But the way the weather turned out, it was pre-school holidays when the weather was best, and actually school holidays were not the best period of weather. So we're discussing with the police whether we make it a bit more flexible when we use police resources. That is more difficult, however, because with flexibility comes how do you actually programme that in a way when you've got limited police resources. So there's a bit to be done on that. But yes, we will be doing extra work with the police this year. And then obviously there's discussions with the police and SFRS as well around if we do go down the route of a bylaw, what that means as well.
And I guess just my sort of second question is just around comms. I think we've been in a lot of meetings, we've been in a lot of community council meetings, and obviously it sounds like a great successful meeting in Boat of Garton. But what I consistently is getting as a directly elected member feedback to me is that the nature stuff looks great, but where is the people in place? And I think we know that by tackling the climate crisis, we will be also tackling great amplifiers of social and economic impacts. But I would really like us to think about how we can translate, by tackling the nature and climate crisis, how we're also strengthening communities. Because I don't think we are making that connection as clear. And I think we're doing our work a bit of a disservice. So I guess my question is just, how can we take the essential and brilliant work that we're doing at the park and translate that into normal language that communities can digest, get behind, and champion themselves? Because I don't know how many other meetings we need to sit in when locals are saying, but where's our swimming pool? Where's our infrastructure? Where are our resources to help do this? Because none of that is in there. And I think, like I say, by tackling the climate crisis, we're also tackling a lot of the issues that communities are facing, but I don't think we're making that link strong enough. So I guess my question was just, how is there work being done to sort of explore, I guess, more engaging comms that our communities can understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to be a little bit careful, just in terms of there are things that communities are very passionate about, that the Park Authority is not the body that will solve those issues. And I think so something like, to that example you said in terms of Aviemore and a swimming pool, yes, there's no doubt a desire from the community in Aviemore to have a swimming pool sorted out. We can look at what we can do through the local development plan to make sure that land is allocated, but ultimately we're not going to be the people who build a swimming pool in Aviemore, and that's not a role that the Park Authority would fulfil. Can we make our comms more specific in terms of that? Yeah, I mean, I think we have done a lot more of that. I mean, you look at the stats within the paper around comms, we're getting a lot of engagement from people on a lot of different issues. The Current Care magazine, which I think is, as I said, just about out, and if people haven't seen it, I can get a copy at lunchtime, is as well, you'd probably say more about the planning and the place side of things in terms of the Park Authority than it is about the nature side. But I think actually the key one for me is, we're discussing today the potential for an adaptation fund for the national park. I mean, the adaptation work around climate is about doing things that will significantly benefit communities, whether that's about flooding, whether that's about fire management, whether that's about making sure that access paths don't get swept away, etc. I think the adaptation side of things of the nature and climate crisis is quite a good way into discussing some of the things with communities where the park authority can make a difference. And I think the one thing we've still got to be clear on is which bits are really about the park authority, which bits are things that are important within the national park, but it's other public bodies that need to pick up and lead on some of those things. So always good to try and make comms as clear as possible. I think we have, I mean, an incredible, when you look at the stuff on page, whatever it is, section 25, I mean, we're doing a huge amount in terms of that interaction, and there's a lot more happening as well around the sort of Cairngorms Voices side of things and the platform that we've put together on that side as well. So I take the point, but I think we are moved significantly in that direction. There's always more to do, but something like the fire bylaws is a really good example of the consultation on that has been really well received by people in terms of that discussion about something that's practical and is meaningful within communities, as well as doing something on the nature side of things.
And so just to amplify that point, it's a bit of a given, being a cliche perhaps, that nature and people are two sides of the same coin, but they absolutely are. And again, for example, flooding, the measures that are being taken to address the climate crisis in relation to species, habitat loss, are exactly the same issues that will address issues that are affecting communities and preventing homes and businesses being flooded. Just one example, and there are lots. We will do everything we can to make our comms as relevant as possible using language that people can connect with. Questions from Peter Cosgrove, followed by Hannah Grist and John Kirk. Peter.
Thank you. It's a question in relation to the first item in the CEO report, farming. One of the elements I noticed is that the Cairngorms Agricultural Advisory Group's focuses on facilitating good engagement and information transfer. And I've struggled to find up-to-date information, basic information on farming in the Cairngorms, and whether that be the number of farmers, size of holdings, tenant versus owner, how much public subsidy they get, all of those kinds of basic bits of information would be very useful, I think, for many board members if that were made available. Is it possible to get a briefing note or something similar on up-to-date farming activity in the park?
Yeah, we can produce that. We can look to get that pulled together and get that round the board as soon as possible, so we can do that in terms of the statistics around the farming within the national park. Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Hannah Grist.
Thanks, convener. I have a question, but I wonder if I could just respond to Lauren's point first, because I thought that was a really good one about how we're kind of sending out messaging. And I wanted to pick up a little bit on the wellbeing economy plan, because I feel like that could actually potentially draw a lot of these ideas together. But I mean, I'm someone that works in this area and I struggle to understand what a wellbeing economy plan actually is and how it's going to help potentially integrate everything. So I wonder if, I'm not sure if it's Grant or Murray, could just speak to that work, and is that something we could take forward to really draw all this together in a way that's quite holistic for what the park can do?
Murray?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, when we have got together and discussed the wellbeing economy with yourselves and with various external stakeholders, and we've coordinated the work through the economic steering group that Xander chairs, other people have also struggled with another term, but there's a general sense that there's a lot of really good exemplars already within the park, and there's many more in the pipeline. So I think when you talk through the practical examples, people begin to get the credit and go, yes, but we're already doing that and it's great and we should do more. So it's strongly linked to the comms agenda around people in place. So I think you're absolutely right to make the connection. So we're working on it. The proposal is that it comes back to the board formally in September.
Thank you very much. John Kirk.
Thank you. It was just on the business side. Chatting to some guys at the weekend. When I go out on my bike at the weekend, I always seem to bump into somebody for a blether. Talking to one of the holiday homeowners, and they have 2 or 3 houses in Netty in a block, and he says numbers are very slow for this year, and costs is obviously something that's starting to affect people coming to the area. I know it's nothing we can do about it, but I think it's something we need to be aware of. And the other problem is catering, is this catering problem for folk to get meals. When you see 25 folk queued outside the chip shop in middle of July in Aviemore, it doesn't stand very good for the area when you can't get into a restaurant. I know it's down to staffing and everything else, but it's just something we need to be aware that this is happening, and it could put a lot of tourists off coming.
Thank you very much, John. Simon McDade.
Thanks, convener. And I just want to follow up actually to the previous speaker's points. Actually, firstly, Lauren's, which I think it would be helpful, perhaps, as part of the comms messaging that Grant talked about in his introduction, particularly around what the national park does and does not do, and what we are and are not responsible for. If we can perhaps improve the messaging on our website to answer that very specific point. I know we do have a page about the National Park Authority, but actually going into much more specific about the statutory duties we have, but also the softer stuff we do. A lot of the stuff that Murray's team is maybe non-statutory, but that we do, or indeed Andy's team, that these aren't statutory things, but we do them as part of our work, and explaining that side of things so that we can, and as board members, we can send people directly to that and anchor that on our homepage at the moment as something that's always there, because as Grant acknowledged, there is incredible interest at the moment in national parks, and we are being used as an example often. And I think it's important to help get that message out there that actually, where our money is coming from, etc., and what it's for, are quite important messages. So I think that would be something I think would help basically do what we're already doing, but actually just amplify that in the right way. That and our comms team are very good at making things into clear messaging, so I think that should be quite easy. And the second point I wanted to pick up was just on Hannah's point there, around some of that stuff that we do that we don't actually necessarily talk about all the time, because one of the great examples that Murray was telling about a number of years ago when we were last doing the economic action plan, we went out and spoke to I think about 100 businesses across the park in person, and as a result of those conversations, some businesses then managed to go on and get appropriate grants from the economic development agencies that they didn't know were available. So although we are not the economic development agency, we did some of that signposting and are providing some of those softer support through things like GrowBiz contracts, etc. So I think that side of things we can amplify to again emphasise the point that Lauren was making about explaining to people what we can and can't do, but also that we are doing our best to do stuff that's not necessarily our statutory duty as well. So I think those were just my points around the comm stuff. And I agree with Grant totally that we need to make sure that we are getting a very clear message about all the good stuff we're doing and what is fact and not fact.
I think they are both very important points. And on the first, there has been misinformation, some deliberate, but there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, and we can do significantly more to clear up that misunderstanding, to explain what we do and what we can't do. Grant?
Yeah, I mean, and agree with all those points. The one I was just going to highlight was that we will have a new website by roughly September this year as well, which will be a lot more focused on the people using it and a lot clearer and a lot smaller. Our website is massive and quite rambling. And so, yeah, by September this year, we should have a new one, which will be much more interactive and a lot more, you'll be directed to the right bits, far easier to find information that you need about things that are going on within the park as well. So that's a good thing that's happening.
And just say in advance of the website upgrade, we'll be improving the information we provide to provide clarity that perhaps isn't provided at the moment. Derek Ross, followed by Russell Jones.
Thank you, Chair. It's on 13, the active and sustainable transport. I was wondering if there's been anything done to liaise with Murray Council regarding the M-Connect service, which is part of the growth deal for Murray.
I don't know off the top of my head, Derek. I don't know if Murray knows anything about that.
Well, yes, the respective teams are in touch, and I did comment to you outside the meeting that we're very pleased to see the M-Connect bus appearing regularly in Granton. It's a great exemplar of the benefits of the growth deal and the connections between Murray and the park. So our respective teams are in touch, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Russell.
Thank you. The recent planning decision, when we discussed the access to the River Spey, I'm not looking to rerun that at all. I mean, fully accepting of the decision that day, but I think it did flag up the difficulties that people have to access the River Spey for canoeing, etc. And I mean, I think it has been designated as a core path. And I just wonder, would we look at that access points to the Spey all through the area of the park, and engage with local people and see if we can provide access to the Spey. You know, whether it's speaking to landowners, etc. Because I mean, I only know the bit I live in locally, and it's pretty difficult, I think, for people to access.
Grant.
Yeah, so we're doing some work at the moment around exactly that, which is looking at I suppose small scale infrastructure improvements that would allow better access to the Spey at certain points. So we're looking at those up and down. I know the access team are doing that work, and we'll be looking at that and seeing what we can do. There'll be some places that's relatively straightforward, and some places I expect where it gets slightly more complicated. But it's certainly something that we can look to use some of our visitor infrastructure capital to do that sorts of work, because it's that sort of thing we should be looking at. So that's in hand. Thank you.
Thank you, John Kirk.
Just going on to this core path thing, there's a lot of landowners don't realise the Spey is a core path. Did you realise this? You guys? No, I didn't till you guys started talking about it. So I think this needs to be made clearer, because we had no idea it was a core path. I mean, we've had an issue with campers and stuff coming on to the bit of Broom Hill, and the state made us put a gate on it and lock it, and we've landed in problems because of access. And it's a core path, but we were not aware of that. The state are probably aware of it, but nobody's told their tenants. So maybe it's something, there needs to be a wee bit of work done on that, guys, please. And if you can, I don't know how you go about it, but I'm sorry.
Should say
bad news.
Yeah, should say it's been a core path for about 20 years, I think. So it's not been a recent thing, but more than happy to let people know that it's a core path. But obviously, I think it's the only river in Scotland that's a core path, is my understanding. The decision was because of the amount of people that paddle the Spey and the use of that. And I think there was quite a lot of discussion around that first core path plan around the whole Spey side of things. So it's been I think relatively successful actually in over the years, reducing some of the tension between anglers and canoeists in terms of that. But if there's issues around making people aware, I mean, I'd have thought, I'm not sure, but I would have thought that in terms of tenancies and leases with estates, it would have been part of the discussion. I'll pick that one up outside the meeting.
Quite well made, John. Henry Deans.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I appreciate what Grant said there with regard to the piece of work. Can I ask that this is something that we're doing on an urgent basis, because I know that the piece of work that they started some time ago didn't come to fruition, and we're now reinventing it and resetting it. And I have spoken to Gavin and Murray with regard to this. So my question is this piece of work now going forward with some pace and with some urgency in order that some of the issues highlighted recently are allayed? Thank you.
Murray Ferguson to come back on
that. Yeah, thanks, Kenny. Yes, as Grant said, it's a piece of work we had in hand anyway. We were out on site with some of the paddlers last May, looking at the need to do the work. But I think you're all absolutely right that the recent planning decision has highlighted the importance and the urgency of this work. So since the planning decision that Russell Jones referenced, I've met with Colin and Gavin and highlighted the urgency of this. It's effectively gone up the priority list. And what we've said is that we'll write to the Scottish Canoe Association. They've got a new convener of their Recreation and Access Forum and offer to do some work in partnership with them. But it's definitely gone up the priority list quite significantly.
Thank you very much. There being no other questions on the CE report, thank you very much, Grant. Move on to item 6, paper 2, Cairngorms National Park Authority 2024-25 budget and operational plan. So just to recap, our core budget from Scottish Government has increased by 12%. This has mainly been capital funding. It's a very good position for the National Park. This is also the first year of delivery of Cairngorms 2030. As members of the Resources Committee have already discussed, we have to be cautious when it comes to longer-term assumptions about our core budget, and that's reflected in aspects of this paper. That said, this budget puts us in a strong position to tackle the nature and climate crises that are impacting directly on our communities. Again, point Lynn mentioned briefly earlier on, and it means we've never been in a better position to support our communities and help make a positive difference for the people who live and work in the park. And that's across a whole range of projects. We'll now consider the paper for decision. The board is being invited to approve the Cairngorms National Park Authority budget and operational plan for 2024-25 as set out in this paper. It's being introduced by Louise Allen, Head of Finance and Corporate Operations. Louise.
Thanks, Andy. Yes. As you say, we've had a really good settlement this year. Grant in aid of just over £9 million, which is an increase of around £1 million altogether. In addition to that, we've had other funding from Scottish Government sources, including for peatland restoration, nature restoration and community-led local development, that all come to about £4.5 million. The other thing that's different this year about the budget is that we're including the impact of the Cairngorms 2030 programme and funding from that programme that is earmarked for delivery this year is another £2.5 million. That Cairngorms 2030 programme, you'll all be aware by now, it's a significant inward investment in the park, and it gives us the opportunity to enhance delivery against the National Park Partnership Plan. It does require dedicated resources, but we will be able to recover those resources through the programme's grant funding, and those come to about £1 million. On top of that, the authority will be making in-kind contributions for staffing, providing indirect services to the project in administration, finance, governance, and so on. And because of that impact, we decided when setting the budget this year to consider C 2030 alongside our regular core work. I think in the past we've tended to think of projects as something a little bit off to the side. But this is becoming very much a bolt-on to our core work. And so the budget this year has considered the resources needed, both financially and in staffing terms, to meet those needs. As always, the largest single item of cost is in staffing, about 40% of the total expenditure budget. We have, as you would expect, an increase on the prior year's figure. That comes from a modelled pay award and additional pension contributions that have been forced upon us. The pay award has been designed to replicate the 2-year main group award offered by Scottish Government, which would give the Park Authority staff approximately 10% of an increase over the 2-year period, 23-24 and 24-25. So seeing it over the 2 years as an entirety. I've set out the allocation of resources to the activities within the operational plan in Appendix 3. And you'll see from that we're making a direct investment of about 6.8 million in the park. In addition, National Lottery funding allows us to invest a further £2.5 million in direct costs and also in dedicated staff to deliver. And that's funding that we've leveraged through Cairngorms 2030. You'll also all be aware of inflationary impacts on our daily lives, and the park is no exception to that. So we have provided a 3% uplift on running costs to account for what we think might be an average over the period for inflation. Sandy mentioned the capital resource split this year, and that is quite different. 3 years ago, we had about £600,000 allocated to our capital budget, and that's now grown to 1.8 million. So the 1 million increase overall in our grant, about 700,000 of that relates to capital. So really the skill in designing this budget has been in taking advantage of that capital allocation and finding new opportunities for that. And an example of those is the Climate Adaptation Fund that Grant has sponsored, where we will encourage applications for schemes that respond to climate change and prepare for future climate-based challenges. So there's a lot of detail provided in the report in the appendices, but I think that gives you an overview of how we've gone about putting everything together.
Thanks very much, Louise. Questions? We have a question from Eleanor.
I've got 2 questions unrelated, Louise. The first one, how much of the operational plan money is pre-booked on projects, and how much is free, sort of on, yeah. Sorry.
Unrestricted funds?
Well, no, it's sort of free to use towards other projects.
Right.
On an ongoing basis, if funds that are committed for the next 2-3 years or.
Well, obviously the Cairngorms 2030 work is a commitment. The general operational plan budget is looked at every year when we set that plan, but it's drawing on the aims of the corporate plan. So at the moment, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing absolutely committed, although it has been designed within the corporate plan in advance. Does that give you an answer, David? Yeah.
If I just expand a little bit on that, Eleanor, in terms of where we're at on multi-year commitments to external organisations, given that we're moving into the second year of the corporate plan, we don't have a significant number of multi-year contractual commitments with third-party organisations. There are some that you would kind of characterise more as a moral rather than a legal commitment. So there are some fundings situations that we have, for example, with community-based groups like Voluntary Action Badenoch and Shrewsbury, to name one as an example, where we know that they are somewhat reliant on our funding support for aspects of what we do. But at the moment, whereas in previous years we've had perhaps 3-year memoranda of understanding with certain organisations that kind of pre-commits resources into those, we've not been operating on that basis on the whole at the moment. So we don't have a lot of forward financial commitments. I think we've got at least one on the peatland side, where I know that we have a multi-year tender that was let with a contractor there, but it's at the limited end of the spectrum, Eleanor, rather than the kind of big end of the spectrum, if that helps.
Yeah, thanks. My second question, and this just might be me, but I'm getting really confused about what grants are available through the park. We're speaking about a new scheme coming in, climate resilience, and added on to existing ones, the CLLD one that will be coming into play. Would it be possible for us to get some sort of list of what's available for communities, and so that we can point? We also have the Cairngorms Trust sitting alongside,
Yeah.
you know, and it's all getting a bit muddied for me.
We can produce that list, Ella, and circulate that around members, and we'll also make sure something on the website as well. I mean, obviously there's the other side of things, which is through Cairngorms 2030. There's the community managed grant scheme will come into effect eventually, so it's not there at the moment, but we'll put that all together so folk can see that.
Thank you. Question from Hannah Grist.
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and thanks, Louise. I particularly wanted to say how useful I found the kind of risks table, that kind of summary at the end of the report there. So thank you for laying that out so clearly for us.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a bit of a question about 27, the efficiency savings. I understand the kind of potential for savings around recruitment and backfills, containment of inflationary increases. I wonder if you could just unpick where that number comes from.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is grasping savings where we can find them. So it's really making everybody aware of the need to achieve value for money there.
Thank you. I think that's kind of helpful in trying to understand, but that feels a little bit like, and absolutely no offense, but like a number plucked from the air a little bit, bearing in mind all the uncertainties that we're faced with. Is that?
It's not a scientific number, no, that's for sure. But the aim is there to make sure we do contain our costs.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just follow up with that? Okay. I had a note somewhere about potential efficiency savings around IT as well in there. I know we've talked a lot about some of the potential challenges around IT and the investment in IT. Is there a kind of tension there between trying to create savings and then trying to create a safe IT system?
There's probably a bigger, in terms of detail, but in terms of where we are with IT, and there's some big government projects going on at the moment, which we're part of as part of the public service reform side of things. So things looking at cloud services across the public sector, not just individual organisations. We've got a meeting coming up next month with Lochlan and Trossachs National Park Authority, looking at shared services again and how best we can make those work. And we've also got a discussion coming up, I think, with Nature Scott as well around ICT stuff. So there's things happening at a national level and within our cluster within the Scottish Government called EILG, and then there's the actual ICT stuff that we can do ourselves and make that more efficient. So that's where we're looking at trying to see how we can find the efficiencies from all those different aspects across the year.
Thank you. Questions from Anne Ross, followed by Lauren McCallum and Steve Micklewright. Anne.
Thank you. It was just to say on the back of what Eleanor was saying when we were talking about community grants, and Grant kindly said that that information would be available. If we have more community events like we attended last Friday, would it be possible at those sort of meetings to have it down on paper so that the volunteers that are there, can pick these things up and see what's available? Thank you.
It's a very good practical suggestion, absolutely. Lauren.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, Louise. 12% is great in this economy. So yeah, well done. I think it's just testament to our ability to deliver. It just, again, for Eleanor and what Anne said, I think, if we can get a list of those, that would be brilliant, and to battle some of the misinformation so that it's not just going into job creation. One of our big, things that gets thrown at us quite a lot, that this money is going directly to communities. So especially if I could get that information, that'd be great. I think that's a great suggestion. Just apologies if this is maybe throwing something sort of left field in there. I think the risk column is great, but in terms of our sort of ethical and leading by example, who do we bank with?
We bank with the Bank of Scotland at the moment, and have done for several years. Well, so
my point was just being in terms of leading by example and making sure that our investments aren't going into perpetuating climate breakdown. We know that financial services is a huge contributor to that. So there's obviously some cash here, and being able to lead by example to other, non-departmental government bodies, etc., about where we put our cash and what that's invested in. Just a question about that, and it would be great to see the park go into its responsibility with the millions that it's got.
Yeah, it's a very fair point, and note the point. We do look at it. One point of reassurance, if it is that in terms of the way that we operate our finances and our cash flow, we are expected to be carrying the minimum required cash flow values to support our business, so that we're not drawing down in advance of our requirements from Scottish Government, so that Scottish Government can manage the Treasury issues nationally rather than individual bodies. So typically there's not a huge amount of cash swirling about in our bank account, and so there's not a lot of investment being done. The team are doing more this year because interest rates have been going up, and we have been trying to manage it a little bit to get some interest value coming back in to support the work that we do. Take on board entirely your point about can we do something as a more leadership area there. You'll appreciate as well, it is one of those areas that when we do look to change bank accounts, it is a huge thing for even for an organisation of this scale to be changing bank accounts and operations. But yes, I mean it's a very fair point, and certainly something that we'll keep on our radar as we look at our ongoing banking requirements. Just to give you assurance from one of my other roles with the Cairngorms Trust, that's something that we've been looking at very actively from the Cairngorms Trust position, so that we can look to move towards a more kind of ethically sourced banking arrangement through the charity there.
Thank you. And just to pick up on Lauren's first point, do we have a breakdown between budget, running costs and delivery?
So we've done a little bit of work around that in terms of where we are, and in effect, if you look at the budget overall, the 13.301 million, setting aside the Cairngorms 2030 bit for a start, the running costs associated with the organisation is about 18% of that total. Obviously, then we're allocating staff against the operational plan side in terms of the work out there in the organisation, but that gives you a good breakdown, which is that 82% of the funding we get from government is going out and doing things within the national park, and 18% goes on running costs within the organisation. We are doing a bit of work around how many jobs that we help to support through that funding. We haven't got that information yet, but we'll be happy to share that in due course once we've got that bit of work a bit more firmed up.
Thanks, Grant. I think it'd be very useful to have that information. Steve McElwright.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. Great report, really clear, which is amazing for such a complicated organisation. Quick question: great, we've got an increase in funding from government, but obviously there are cuts elsewhere. Are we exposed to any risk from those cuts coming through, or is that all covered in what the budget does?
I think the biggest risk we face is in potentially any funding being clawed back over the year. And the key to that is to get the priority work committed. So that's what heads of service will be working on over the next months, to make sure that we can tie down those funds that we consider a priority.
Just a wider point across the park, because I think is a good point, Steve, which is that, I mean, obviously, Scottish Forestry had their budget reduced for woodland by 40%. Each IE have got a tighter budget settlement. The local authorities are obviously looking at their budgets at the moment, but they are tight, let us say. And so yes, so in terms of the park rather than the park authority, but the park, there will always be impacts of that within the national park. And we just got to try and work out how best that we can work with people to still maintain delivery within the park and see where we can work with people. But yeah, there will be impacts of that. It's just a difficult moment to say exactly where, because we're not exactly sure how those budgets all play out.
Thank you. Sorry, Steve, want to come back?
Yeah, that's great, Grant, but we are not at risk from those cuts. That was what I wanted to be really clear about. So that helps to approve the budget. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill Lobbin.
No, today's report's really great, but given the restrictions in the Scottish Government's financial envelope, are we factoring in the potential that in future years the impact of an extra national park may have on our budget? Because I can't imagine that their financial ability is expanding in line.
I mean, I think we're obviously doing, as I said, there's this big bit of work going on around public service reform within central government at the moment, which is, is impacting across all public bodies. If a new third national park comes online, we're looking at things like shared services again, and all the backroom functions that the existing parks can do for a new national park, so that we're not duplicating and not adding in costs. So that's one area. And I think the other bit is that, I mean, the answer is no, we do not know what the cost will be of a new national park, and we don't know what impact that will have on the park authority. That's the honest truth of where we are at the moment. We're still a couple of years away from a new national park coming in. There's obviously a need for us to set out our stall in terms of what we deliver and what we consistently deliver on these bigger Scottish Government aims across what they're looking to do. So I think as long as we are consistent on that, but we'll need to be aware of that as it comes forward and make sure that the Park Authority puts forward its position in terms of the Cairngorms.
And David,
just to follow up what Grant says, Bill, as well, in terms of the contingency planning and the risk analysis work that we do in finance, and pretty much constantly, not for any one decision, looking at what the impact might be in our budget, but pretty constant looking forward years and looking at what the potential impact of a 5%, 6%, 10% reduction in our budget might be, and what the potential consequences of that might be, and how we might have to work through those. So there's a kind of constant rolling kind of risk analysis being done through the finance team in the background, so that we've got an awareness of what that might mean and what actions we might take to have to mitigate that. So that's an ongoing piece of work that we do.
Thank you. And Ross.
Thank you. Just a thought crossed my mind following on from Bill. If we're going to be sharing, and I can see the wisdom in that, having shared services with other national parks, do you think it'll get to the point where there'll just be one board overviewing various national parks in Scotland? Because if you're rationalising resources behind the scenes, is there the argument for that?
I'll let you take that question, Grant.
There is no proposal to do that. I mean, we've run shared services with Loch Lomond for 15, at least 10 years, if not longer. 15, yeah. Around things like joint procurement. So we've got a procurement officer that we work across both parks. Terms and conditions, things like that. IT, GIS, planning. So the planning portal and that side that we use is hosted by Loch Lomond. So there's all that side of things is very doable with any third national park in terms of extending some of those services across the way. The governance arrangements aren't part of those discussions, because that's a government thing. But there's no proposal to do that as far as I'm aware of.
Sandra McDade.
Yeah, just to provide further answer, having been in some of the meetings around the early stages of what the changes to national parks are going through Parliament, and if there was going to have been a move to have one national park service for Scotland, that would have happened, and there was no appetite at any level of government, ministerial, locally, or even having that exploration. I think it might have been a one-sentence discussion at one point, but it is not something that, and I think in terms of the context of how national parks work in Scotland, where we have a greater focus on communities, etc., to ensure that they are rooted, I think that's part of why that didn't even come up as a discussion. Really, it's a different different type of national park compared to, say, America, where you haven't got communities in the national park in the same way, for example, and it's more managing an environment. So it wasn't something that came up. But David, things go full circle, Director of Corporate Services for all the national parks again.
It is absolutely critical for our relationship with our communities that we have that relationship embedded in our structure, and we'd have views for any moves to change that. Eleanor.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back in on staffing levels. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and recently there's been a lot in the press about, the national park is just paying for jobs for folks sitting in Granton. And I think when you see the figures at 40%, you can keep me right, Louise, I think we should be proud of our staff and proud of the amount of money that we're paying our staff, being a living wage employer. I think that's all good. It's good for the economy. It's offering good jobs, worthwhile jobs. And certainly, I don't see people sitting about doing nothing. I think they're working hard for their money. And as long as I've got this figure in my head that, you know, staffing should be less than 50% of our sort of budget, I've always been kind of had that figure in mind. So I think we're doing a good job, and I think we should be proud of it. And I think we should be batting back to folk that are saying, you know, that we're just creating jobs for folk. We are creating jobs for folk, but that's something good, surely.
Absolutely, to all of that. Staff not only working hard, but working with a passion to serve the community, people who live and work in the park, as well as the wider nature interests that we discuss on a regular basis. Sandra.
Just want to come in support of Eleanor's point in entirety, actually, and add something, which is, you know, we talk a lot about wanting more young people in the national park. These are professional graduate jobs sometimes in things that wouldn't exist in the national park area otherwise, that allow young people to come back and live in the community they grew up in. I think that's really important. And I think actually having civil service jobs paid for by Edinburgh in a rural community is important. And actually, I think also we use some statistics in the council where so for every 10 jobs you directly create, you will create 3 indirectly in the community and a further 1 through suppliers. So, you know, for every 10 jobs we're creating actually here ourselves, we're also creating 4 within the community, and those are, you know, significant numbers. When we're talking about, we have a reasonable sized organisation now, there are a lot of jobs being created by the Park Authority being here, and as Eleanor says, don't see people, you know, sitting around doing nothing. They're out meeting with communities, as was happening last week. They're doing the job on the ground, and I think that's important. And as Eleanor says, I think we should be, you know, arguing that point quite strongly.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? None, in which case the board's invited to approve the Cairngorms National Park Authority budget and the operational plan for 2024-25 as set out in this paper. Are we content to approve? Thank you very much. And thank you, Louise, and your team for all the work that's got into this. Thank you very much. We'll now have a 10-minute recess. Thank you. Thank you, Board. We're resuming our formal board meeting at item 7, paper 3, Managing Deer for Climate and Nature Consultation. So this paper builds on the discussion we had as a board at our last meeting in Tom and Towel. It sets out the Park Authority's response to the Scottish Government consultation on managing deer for climate and nature. This is a good opportunity for us to highlight key issues to the government. The board's being invited to approve the response as set out to pen, and I'll invite Colin McLean, Head of Management, to introduce the paper. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to you all. This paper sets out the Park Authority's response to the Scottish Government consultation on managing deer for climate and nature, which runs until the 29th of March. And this consultation builds on the Deer Working Group recommendations that were accepted by Scottish Government. There are 6 themes within the consultation. We have focused largely on 3 of them. The first theme is about enhancing the natural environment, where the government proposes the creation of a deer management nature restoration order, which would provide NatureScot with the power to require nature enhancement rather than just dealing with damage, which is the limit of the current powers. And we are broadly welcome of that approach. We think it helps us tackle the twin challenge of nature and climate within the park. However, there is a lot of detail that needs to be considered. We need to know how DMN ROs might be applied, what the criteria would be, where they might not be applied, for example, how they will deal with areas where there is a mix of herbivores, particularly sheep, and how these DMN ROs tie in with the quite wide-ranging existing powers that NatureScot already have under sections 7, 8 and 10 of the existing Deer Scotland Act. Moving on to theme 4, which is about changes to the closed seasons. Any closed season for female deer is an attempt to balance the ability to reduce deer damage or to manage deer populations, balance that with the need to protect dependent deer calves. And there are 2 dates involved in any closed season. There's a spring date and an October date, and those 2 dates have very different issues surrounding them. So changes to the spring date, we largely agree with. There are no issues. The change to that date does not compromise deer welfare in any way. It does have some impact on stalker sensibilities. A lot of people do not like to gralach hinds where there are very well developed fetuses inside. That is understandable. It can be a bit distasteful, but it's not a requirement under this that they actually have to do so. It becomes a choice. However, the date in October, where calves are born and are running at foot with their hinds, if they're potentially orphaned at that time, then they will almost certainly die. So there are clear deer welfare implications in changing that date. We have recommended that date is not changed. And our key rationale for that is that we've carried out numerous deer reductions around the country, including within the Cairngorms, without needing to change that date. So therefore, why move in any direction to compromise deer welfare if it's not necessary for population control? Finally, under theme 5, which is about venison, we agree that there are many advantages in changing the current venison dealer's license system. It has a lot of weaknesses. There's clearly room for improvement, and there may well be an advantage in putting the onus on the seller of deer to report the number of deer he or she has sold, as opposed to the buyer of deer, because that might lead to a more effective cull reporting system around the country. Within the Cairngorms, we have a very good cull reporting system and we get good data, but nationally, the collection of cull data is a bit of an issue. So we seek your approval for that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. I'll now invite questions. Eleanor.
Yeah, Colin, I just want to pick up on something you said about other herbivores, mainly sheep. And I do take slight exception to that because there's roe deer, and we don't seem to talk about roe deer at all. 2 years ago, when we were talking about the new national park plan, we spoke about roe deer and the unknown quantity that there were, and there was to be work done as to establish the amount of roe deer. We're now 2 years on, nearly, from that discussion, certainly, and I wondered what stage it was at, that allows us to say it's mainly sheep, because to my mind, and it's anecdotal, there's a heck of a lot of roe deer out there that are going to do damage to young trees,
Yeah, that's a perfectly fair point. DMNROs potentially don't just apply to, they would apply to all deer species in Scotland, or they could apply to all deer species in Scotland. So roe deer would be included in that. They've broadly been looked at. Having said that, they have broadly been looked at in terms of reducing red deer populations on the hill, and people have picked up on the illogicality of reducing red deer populations on the hill, where government is funding subsidising large numbers of sheep on the hill, on the same hill. And there is an issue about how those two areas are brought together. If we're reducing deer, it only makes sense to reduce sheep as well in those circumstances. Where are we involved in monitoring roe deer numbers across the park? We haven't made much progress on that. There is a big information gap there in terms of all woodland deer populations within the park, and it's something we do need to improve our knowledge on.
So when are we likely to make progress on that? I know it's slightly off the response to the consultation, but I do think it's important that we're looking at deer in totality.
Yeah, I agree. It is important. We have access to Forestry and Land Scotland's data set on the various ways that they estimate populations of deer within their forests, and that is a proportion of woodland within the park. Other than that, we have not much information, and that's clearly something we need to work on if that's what the board wants us to do. But we don't have a clear work stream for that in the moment.
But it's not it's what the board agreed, surely, in the National Park Partnership Plan. Am I wrong there?
And I do follow on that. Yeah, so following the discussions we had as part of the National Park Partnership Plan, it was agreed that we shouldn't have an action trying to establish a roe deer population, because it would be very difficult to do, and it would be prohibitively expensive. Well, not prohibitively, it would be very expensive for the outcome of telling us something that we sort of know where the impacts are high anyway. So it wasn't a National Park Partnership Plan action to do a roe deer population survey for those factors. But that's not to say that an increased understanding of the impacts of roe deer wouldn't be a beneficial thing. It's not actually an action in the plan. Okay, thank you. And questions from John Kirk, followed by Jeeva Blackett.
The first bit's not really a question. The first bit was really the effect that taking deer numbers, sheep numbers down will have on other wildlife. I think the amount of invertebrates that it comes from the dung and off these animals does encourage bird life. I was just sitting watching the peeweets the other day, following the sheep up and down the field. It's absolutely amazing the correlation between livestock and the bird life. That's why the farms are so good with the wading birds and stuff. My question is on the deer licensing. Anything goes into a slaughterhouse has to be vet checked. Are we saying by taking this license it won't be vet checked? If not, does that not affect the export? I don't know. I'm looking for answers.
So carcasses that go into game dealers are checked, and there's nothing within this proposed which would change that. It would lengthen the potential season for which carcasses would be entering the game dealers, but that has no particular animal health or human health implication.
If the licensing would open up a black market?
Not quite sure why it should do that.
I just wondered whether it would do, if they weren't going through the game dealers or if there was no licensing. I thought it might have been easier for them to get rid of some other ways.
Yeah, under the venison dealer license, there's no reason why carcasses would still be sold to a game dealer. That is still likely to be the main route for most carcasses to go, and nothing within that changes the requirement for veterinary inspections or anything like that. I don't think there are negative implications to that.
Thank you. Chief of Blackett, followed by Lauren McCallum.
Yeah, thank you, convener. Colin, I think this response shows clearly that the meeting we had in Tom and Town was very useful, because you've picked up on a lot of the concerns and questions that we had. But just on Eleanor's point, the roe deer are a real issue, and I don't, they're causing accidents on roads probably more than the red deer are. They just suddenly shoot out. I'm just worried that the red deer are going to get the blame for damage, because you do see them on the open hill now as well. And I don't want to see the red deer, which is so iconic and which so many tourists want to see, getting the blame when the roe deer numbers are escalating. Is that making sense? And I'm not sure that we've kind of got that.
Yes, I mean, there's no evidence that roe deer numbers are escalating across the park. I think they're quite high in certain areas, but they are culled by people throughout the park, and numbers are certainly kept in check. And I say, deer management nature restoration orders will potentially apply to all deer species if that is required.
Just to say, because it's talked a couple of times, but happy to add in a specific paragraph on roe deer within the consultation response to highlight the issue, and to say that we want to ensure that the issue of roe deer damage on both agriculture and woodland is taken into account when looking at the potential for DMNRs. So we'll add in a paragraph on that issue specifically.
That would make me happy, because I can't believe what you're saying, Colin. You used to see 2 or 3 roe deer. Now it's 30s and 40s you're seeing. So they're definitely on the increase.
I think that addition would answer several members' concerns. Lauren McCallum.
Yeah, thank you. And because I was at the Rural Housing Summit, I didn't actually go to Tom and Hull. So apologies if this is a bit naive, but in Objective 3 in the background, it's to reduce the negative impacts of red deer and other herbivores across the national park, to enable woodlands to expand, heather loss to be reversed, and peatlands to recover. Just on the heather loss piece, and this is something, I live in just past Alnevert, and I can see some of the heather getting pretty long. In terms of Kappa, is this, if we're culling too many deer, and I know grazing is really important so that the chicks can basically get through, is this going to have a negative impact on the species that we're really, trying desperately to save? Sorry if there's a bit of a naive question and a bit of a loaded question. It's not supposed to be, but how do we balance that so that it's not going to have a negative impact on the grazing that's needed for the Kappa?
So heather loss is not really a concern within our Caledonian pinewood remnants, which is where most of the Kappa are found. It's more of an issue in parts of the park where there's been a long history of heavy grazing. We know that if more than 40% of the shoots that heather produces in any one year are removed, then that heather plant starts to decline. And we're seeing that across certain parts of the park, particularly the southern part of the park, where heather has been replaced by grass. And that, in general, is negative for biodiversity. So it's something we want to reverse. But it's not really an issue which should inflict with capercaillie in any way.
Thanks. Pete Cosgrove, followed by Anne Ross.
It's just a short point, basically to support Eleanor and Jiva. And also to emphasise something which is not really picked up in this is that there seems to be increasing evidence, although it's not incontrovertible, that the increase in roe deer is also resulting in increases in ticks and tick-borne Lyme disease for members of the local community and visitors. And so when we're talking about controlling roe deer, it's not just about nature conservation. This is about the well-being of visitors and local people. And so we could maybe just pick up and remind that it isn't all about nature conservation, that there's a community benefit in doing this.
Thank you. And Ross.
Point 4 refers to the need to ensuring that the development of DMNROs with the development of long-term deer management incentives to ensure that where deer levels are taken down and spotting income falls. And it goes on, my question is what mitigation would be put in to these areas where sporting income is falling due to the culling of larger numbers of deer?
Crump.
Yeah, so there's a bit of work happening at national level looking at what deer management support needs to be put in nationally. In terms of incentives, there's obviously the work that we're doing to trial one area in terms of deer reductions within the national park, and Nature Scot are looking at a couple of other potential schemes, one looking at Sika in particular and one looking at roe deer and such like in lowland Scotland. So those work's going on, and then to look at how that will help pay for some of the public policy outcomes associated with that in the future. And there's obviously a bigger conversation to be had about what happens at national level. The other part of that is the consideration about how you support the stocking side of things within that going forward if you have lower deer numbers in certain places, and that those conversations are happening. I expect they'll happen. We've got the deer management round table on Tuesday, I think, down in Battleby, and the minister's coming to that as well, and that'll be one of the ones that comes up in that, I suspect, Anne, in terms of how that the future support, the incentive side to this that goes alongside some of the more regulatory stuff that's in this current consultation. I think that's one of the key bits, is trying to make sure we've got the incentives right for the future.
Thank you. My concern comes from, gamekeepers losing and stalkers losing their jobs. And so is it going to be you don't know until you've met this coming week. You were talking about the meeting with the minister, but are they looking at subsidies to the estates, or how? I'm concerned about the employment side of it.
Yeah, and so I suppose that's one of the things, is we're trialling a couple of things in terms of how we can support the costs around some of these culls. There is a longer term piece of work that needs to look about what support is needed, both in terms of the stocking side and then also looking at some of the infrastructure around that as well, which we're looking at, and ourselves and Nature Scot are working on a paper at the moment around that to do some of those things. So yeah, it's definitely right up there, and in terms of consideration, it's slightly to the side of this consultation because it's the other bit to it, but it is definitely part of it, because if you're going to put a DMNRO in place, you need to also have the support mechanisms in place to support that, I think. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Anne. Steve Nicholwright.
Yeah, Colin, thanks. Mine's about the close season, and I understand the balance between welfare and the need to manage deer. So the deer working group proposed the end of the close season early September. Government's proposing end of September, and we are suggesting that there's no change. I'm curious to know quite why the National Park is promoting that, because no deer manager is going to be compelled to use the full season. That's an option for them. And then if they want a cull deer later in the year, they then obviously have to get permission to do that. So I'm concerned about that. I do understand the welfare issue and the balance needed, but in view of the deer working group suggesting beginning of September, it being moved back by government to 30th September, I don't really understand why the National Park is no change.
It's recognising the concerns around orphaning dependent calves at a time when they will die if their mothers are shot and they are not shot at the same time themselves. And also recognising the fact that deer reductions have taken place in numerous locations across the Cairngorms and across Scotland without the need for that change. So there is a strong argument why compromise or why make any move in the direction which compromises deer welfare if there is no proven need to do that to manage our deer populations.
So a deer working group that worked for a long period of time made that recommendation.
Steve, yeah.
On your mic.
Sorry. So the deer working group made a recommendation early September very clearly over a long period of time, an extended period of thinking about this matter. I understand it may not be an issue in the Cairngorms, but this is going to be national policy and it is an issue elsewhere. So, and no land manager is compelled to use the full open season. So again, just because it's not an issue in the Cairngorms doesn't mean that this ability, and I completely understand the well-wishing, and I have worries about it. I don't like the idea of deer being, young deer kind of dying like this, but there is the balance between nature restoration and getting that right in certain areas, and I really don't understand quite why the Cairngorms, because it doesn't have a problem, is not acknowledging that an extended season might be helpful elsewhere.
I think just to make the point that this is a response on behalf of the Cairngorms National Park Authority to a government consultation. But Colin, do you want to pick up?
The deer reductions have been carried out throughout Scotland. It's not just the Cairngorms issue. So they've been carried out throughout Scotland. Some very significant deer reductions out with the Cairngorms have been carried out without this change. So, many of the stakeholders we deal with in deer management are expressing concerns about the implications for deer welfare of this change. And I think it's reasonable that we give some backing to those calls. There is no evidence that this change is needed.
Once again, the deer working group, who were a cross-sectoral group of people, worked on this for some considerable time. So that was their recommendation. The government have moved it back to 30th of September, which I absolutely support. I still don't understand why the Cairngorms is making this particular recommendation. I wonder if Andy can help.
So I think the convening. Yeah, sorry to say that this is a recommendation. These are recommendations being proposed on behalf of the National Park Authority. There are certainly wider issues for discussion here, but in terms of the relevance and the competence of discussion on this paper, I think we've had that response. Andy, do you want to? No, okay. Grant.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the only point I make on that is that I suppose we're listening, but our professional expertise in this and the view of Colin and the team is that it's entirely up to members to decide whether you want to stick with what we've said or change it to something else. So it's and there are views on both sides, and there are good reasons on both sides why you might want to do something different or stick with what we're suggesting. But I suppose what we're putting forward is the best professional advice from the Park Authority. If the board want to accept that, that's fine. If the board want to change the date, Steve, then that's absolutely fine as well. That's up to you guys. We're not saying that there's not a different argument that you could make.
It's not a big date.
I'm not asking for the date, slightly more nuanced statement about the explanation about why I don't know what's happening. I suspect the park would want to recommend this particular change, and I'm fine with that from the park's perspective. But just a little bit more an explanation would be helpful. I think.
Well, we can put in more of an explanation as to why we're suggesting that within the consultation response. That's absolutely fine to do that.
Sandra?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think as has been reflected by others, that the response has picked up a lot of the discussion that we had, and I think that's really helpful. And I think obviously we are talking about this as a response on behalf of the Park Authority, but obviously it's going to get responses from a broad cross-section across Scotland, and it's their job to reflect the national interest and the interest in different communities, and what isn't necessarily right here might be right elsewhere. So, that will happen, I'm sure. And I think it's good that we are seen to be listening to stakeholders as well. I'm happy if there are wording that we can add that sort of makes the nuance point. I have no issue with supporting that as well, I think, but it's quite positive that we've got to this point where we have what I think is a very reflective and balanced response.
Thank you very much. There being no further points or questions, is the board content to approve the response to the Scottish Government is set out at Appendix 1, including the clarification as discussed and agreed?
And the RODIA.
And RODIA, yeah. Yes, thank you very much. Now moving on to item 8, paper 4, Sustainable Tourism Action Plan Update. So again, for background, in 2022, the board approved the 5-year Sustainable Tourism Action Plan. It's one of a series of action plans that build on the work in the Cairngorms National Park Partnership Plan. And this update covered the work that's been done to date across the partnership. So the board is being asked to note progress in delivery of the Sustainable Tourism Action Plan 22-27. The paper will be introduced by Murray Ferguson, Director of Planning and Rural Development. And I'll make the point briefly, Murray, that this is your final board paper after 20 years with the National Park. We owe you a huge debt of gratitude for everything that you've done in that time. Much, much more on this landmark moment after our formal session. But Murray, if for the moment, would you like to introduce your paper?
Thank you very much for that. Heather French, our very experienced sustainable tourism officer, actually led on the preparation of the paper, but in the circumstances, Heather graciously agreed that I could introduce it. But she's still got to answer all the tricky questions. So as you say, the plan was agreed in 2022, and board member Xander McDade chairs the Tourism Partnership, which oversees all this work. But we did come back to this board and annually to make sure the work gets a high profile and adequate scrutiny. So we were delighted to receive the European Charter again on behalf of the park. I mean, that's not an award to the Park Authority as such, it's an award to the destination and all the partners working together. It very much strengthens our international reputation in Europe. Xander was out to the Europark event to collect the certificate, and there's a small article about that in the Cairn magazine that's getting distributed around the park at them. Just wanted to highlight a few particular things, some of which have changed a little bit since the paper was written. There's a lot of interest in the visitor levy legislation, which is going through Parliament at the moment. I'm sure you all know that that's a piece of legislation that allows local authorities to raise a levy, a type of fee or tax effectively, which is charged on overnight accommodation, or some types of overnight accommodation. It will in time bring in significant new funds, which will be much needed, and especially with the demise of recent funds like Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund, for example. That's history, that's now gone. The legislation completed stage 2 just on the 12th of March there, and it is still programmed, we understand, to be completed by June, along with appropriate statutory guidance that's being prepared by Visit Scotland. Now, we've fed into the consultation in that, through a response. We've also met with the Bill team, and there's a few references to that in the paper. I'm pleased to say this at the very at stage 2 debate, some amendments were agreed that strengthen the role of national parks in the decision-making process. So local authorities will need to consult with national park authorities if the legislation is passed as it currently stands, and that's very, very welcome. At Visit Scotland, there's been a few changes recently. They've appointed a new chair, Stephen Leckie, who is a well-known figure in Scottish tourism circles. He's a hotelier from Perthshire. And we know that Visit Scotland fairly recently announced a number of changes to the Quality Assurance Scheme. And that's a scheme that's been around for a lot of years, which effectively gives businesses the opportunity to have a number of stars associated with them. Since that announcement, we've kept in touch with the Cairngorms Business Partnership to see what the business reaction to that has been. It's been relatively muted as far as we can see within the park, even though it does affect 135 businesses who currently use the scheme. From what we've heard, it seems that it's those businesses at the 4- and 5-star end who are most likely to want to do something else, but we'll see what happens around that. Cairngorms Business Partnership Grant already an update on the change to their chief executive fairly recently and what they're doing on the business plan. Just to say that we're in touch with them and they're interested in arranging a board-to-board meeting, which we're trying to programme after the summer in some way, because they play a very important role as being both the Chamber of Commerce for the part, but also the private sector destination organisation. And then lastly, I was just going to highlight all the work that's happening on community-led tourism, which fits quite well with the community meeting we had last week as well. The conference was held recently in Scotland and it was attended by board member Kenny Deans here and Heather. And it sounds from what I've heard like it was a big success, and it was good to see that many of the examples that we have within the park are being highlighted, and there's an opportunity to do even more of that kind of work, which is exactly fitting with the wellbeing economy references that we talked about earlier. So the board are asked to note progress with the delivery of the action plan, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Murray, and what an incredible story. I'll go first to Sandra McDade, Chair of the Tourism Partnership.
Thanks very much, Convener, and congratulations, Murray, on reaching it to the final board paper. We'll need to have another board meeting next week to make sure we can have another round for you. I think I would just reflect a few points. It's really significant actually getting the charter accreditation. There are only 2 places in the UK that have that accreditation. So considering there are 15 national parks currently in the UK, we are one of only 2 places in the UK and the only national park, I think, actually, that has this accreditation. And as Murray says, it isn't about the park authority having the accreditation. Our accreditation assessment includes a whole range of partners who give up their time, etc., to ensure that we can get that accreditation. So it is a really significant part of work that is going on across the park. I think also just to reflect some of what we've discussed earlier around things like the benefits of in national parks influencing tourism policy. So we have had the Public Finance Minister Tom Arthur had a session with business leaders in the park here. Now, he did that in both the 2 national parks. I think he may have done a few others around the country, but again, that was an opportunity for our businesses to be able to have their say directly to government ministers to influence policy. And this is why people do give up their time to support a lot of the work that we do in this. Now, you know, as the chair of the tourism group, I am very grateful of them giving up that time, because they do it quite willingly and freely, and they give up quite a lot of time actually, which as business owners is particularly a significant commitment because we've got businesses to run. So I think there's a lot of changes happening in the sector, and that is something that's been reflected in a lot of our meetings over the last year. And I've only been in the hot seat since, I think, August, September of last year when Janet left. So I've only seen some of it, but actually there is concern, I think, probably in the sector about how much change there is going on at once, as there is in a lot of different sectors. But we are conscious when we are thinking about agendas for that group of making sure that we're monitoring impact of decisions when they come through, and some of that will take some time. So I think broadly there's a lot of work going on, and you know, Heather and the team are doing a huge amount of work on this all the time, and we're very fortunate to have experienced officers looking at the area, which does allow us to compete at a high level. I think, just reflecting on what Murray said in terms of there are significant changes going on at Visit Scotland at the moment, and that again will add to concern in the sector about changes as to how things are working. So I think broadly this is something that will require a lot of careful monitoring over the next year to see how a lot of these changes will impact the sector, and make sure that we continue to provide a very strong voice at the highest levels of government on those impacts.
Thank you, Sandra. It is a time of incredible challenge across the sector, with more challenges to come, and very important that we as a park authority are seen to be supporting a critically important section of our community. Shiva.
Yeah, thank you. I also sit on that group and have done for a number of years. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Heather for all the work that she does, because it's a huge amount of work. My question really is around the visitor investment, and with the levy proposals going through Parliament at the moment, how do you think that will affect the visitor giving? And how will it work, given that we have, is it 5 or 6 local authorities? Will the money go to the local authorities for their infrastructure? And then you will have different levels, presumably. They will all set their own levels. And I've heard it said that Aberdeenshire are looking to get some of this money. I think Murray's reaction is similar to mine.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of people who are looking to get some of this money, so that's why I smiled. Yes, the way the system works is the legislation is giving the opportunity, the choice to local authorities to develop this scheme if they want, and the guidance is setting out parameters that are around how they'll do that. But so it will be at local authority discretion as to what rate to set and what the money is used for. But the legislation is building in some important provisos about the things they have to take into account. So, for example, this business of consulting with the National Park Authority and keeping up that dialogue with the park authorities will be fundamental. It is a hugely important source of funds because it will provide a source of funds to do things in quite new ways and potentially to match against other pots of money. And I think it is important that we're looking at it quite strategically and not just thinking of individual projects. That's the opportunity. It will be about 2026 before the money actually starts appearing. So the whole process still has quite a period to go. And I think the challenge at the moment is maybe straddling the gap between now and 2026, when we know that there's some quite significant funding challenges even for the projects we want to do now. But Heather, you also might have things to add.
Yeah, just to say briefly, I mean, you asked about the visitor giving, and it may well have an impact on that. I think there's an issue there for us to communicate perhaps the difference between the two different things. There's no real data at the moment that we have on how that might be affected. We're about to start doing the next visitor survey, which we mentioned in the paper there as well. So I'm quite keen to have a question in there that gives us data about visitors' perceptions on what that money should be spent on, because I think that is a very powerful tool then in having some of those conversations with local authorities.
Thank you. Got Hannah Grist, followed by Anne Ross.
Hi. Thanks, really nice update and good to see. My question was really around, I guess, camper vans. They sit within this. I don't want to open up a whole can of worms, but I'm going to anyway, absolutely. Basically, because there's very little mention. If we go on, so as a camper van, if you go on the Cairngorms website, our website, there's very little information. It points you to Croynick East and very little else. So there's a lot of informal websites that people are then going to go to do wild camping around the Cairngorms. So I guess there's a couple of things there. One is which is none of these kind of pre-visit information emails going to go out to people that haven't booked anything. So they're missing key information about how would like behaviour to happen around the park. And secondly, some of the kind of community-based bringing camper vans into the communities or using these kind of more informal airs or campsites are not being very well publicised. I know there are questions about how much we should be publicising businesses in the Cairngorms, but I feel like we're kind of missing a bit of work around how we can invite camper vans in responsibly that can bring money into our communities and work with that. I just wonder where we're at with that.
Well, you're absolutely right about it being a can of worms. First of all, in relation to the connection to the visitor levy, it's been considered, but it's not currently proposed that the visitor levy will be charged on camper van nights. So some people thought that would be a good idea, but at the moment that's not part of the legislation. So people only pay if it's fixed accommodation. We have done quite a lot of work at a national level on camper vans. So Visit Scotland fairly recently produced a very good, for the first time, some very good technical information about camper vans and sentiments and what visitors are looking for. And that's a really good basis to help do forward planning. Within the last few years, funds from the Green Recovery Fund to fund the Cairngorms Business Partnership to produce proactively welcoming information about where camper vans could go without causing an impact, how to make sure the money was going back into the local authorities. So a leaflet is produced that our rangers promote quite actively, and they really like it because it's a good engagement tool to go and speak to a camper van with a positive conversation about, you're welcome, here's more information about where you can go to have less impact. There are still many challenges, as you know, and I was at a meeting of the National Visitor Management Group yesterday where Scottish Land and Estates officer was talking about the concern from land managers, particularly outside the national park in that case, about camper vans pulling off roads informally and then having to deal with waste-related issues. And the concern outside the park was with the reduction in ranger services that are likely to be seen. There's more and more concern from land managers. Now, it didn't come up in our conversation last night with Scotland Estates, but I know that is a concern across the park. Your point about AIRS, which is the French form of having small sites to welcome camper vans, we have got a separate infrastructure plan, and there's a whole strand, which the work that was led by Colin Simpson. We have got a whole strand of work in there to try and promote that area of work, but it still has some way to go. We've got to try and find a model that is, financially attractive for the land manager and is more benefit than disadvantage, and I think that's a bit of trouble at the moment. There's probably the economics of it don't work in terms of the amount of hassle that's involved, but we have got some good examples within the park, and you mentioned a couple of them.
Thank you, Murray. We've got Anne Ross, followed by Russell Jones and Steve McElwright. Anne.
Thank you. My question is regarding the visitor levy. Jiva mentioned about the 5 local authorities. What's going to happen if one local authority decides not to implement the visitor levy? How are you going to have parity across the park then regarding that?
Yeah, I mean, it'll work because the visitor levies are a local authority area, so the local authority will have discretion as to what they spend that funding on. But for instance, if there's one in Highland and not one in Murray, well, Highland Council will have an extra fund to spend on tourism within the Highland Council area, and Murray Council wouldn't have an extra fund to spend in the Murray Council area. So yes, there would be a discrepancy, I suppose, in terms of what the local authority would spend within that area. It obviously doesn't change what we would do, but obviously we would seek to influence the one that had the visitor levy to make sure that that was helping to deliver the sustainable tourism action plan within that part of the Cairngorms. It obviously would only be able to be used within the boundary of that local authority.
How you're having conversations, from my understanding from what you've said just now, with the local authorities. What if the local authorities decide to put that money into other things, into a central pool for the whole of, say, Aberdeenshire rather than that area?
I don't think that's been established in terms of exactly, but they can only spend it on certain things. So the bill sets out that you can only spend it on certain things to do with tourism. So you can't just put it into a thing. It's got to be done, and it's got to be separately accounted for as well within the local authorities' budgets. Have got to show what they're spending that on. But obviously we'd work with them in the same way we do with anything else in terms of trying to make sure that we're doing the right things within that area. But it would be for instance, it'd be for Highland Council to decide at the moment as the legislation as to what they spend those tourism funds on within Highland Council.
Thank you. Russell Jones.
Thank you. Just on the camper van, I think Highland Council agreed on last week that we're going to approach Scottish Government to ask to look at ways that we could levy vans who are not staying in static sites. I think there's something ongoing. But actually, what I was going to say was the part about the initiatives designed to draw visitors to quieter areas of the national park. Do we think that we can focus or refocus on that in the next year or two? I think quite often. I mean, I can understand why it happens, but we still see on the front of brochures and the websites, etc. We still see pictures of Loch Morlich, and it's beautiful, and that's the bit. And then we complain everyone seems to be going to Loch Morlich, but if we could, refocus on trying to, have pictures of Tomintoul or Lagan or whatever, and try and stretch people out across the park, it might help take people away from the honeypots and also help the economies of villages and communities elsewhere.
Well, the work you're referring to that's referenced in the paper is the sort of work we did in Badenoch, where we had a 3-year funded partnership project, and similarly up at Tomintoul and Glenlivet we had the landscape partnership project funded big time for a few years. So the challenge for us is how to keep doing that when we don't have a specific funded project with a dedicated. For example, we've been relatively successful in managing the legacy of these initiatives through the Cairngorms Business Partnership, where part of our funding that we give to the business partnership as a grant is specifically flagged against supporting the community partners to keep promoting these areas, and that's the mechanism that we currently use. So another example is the Snow Road Scenic Route, which was developed over a 2-year period, maybe 8-9 years ago now, but we contribute to the cost of keeping that going through CBP effectively. Your point about photographic use in Loch Morlich, I'll leave Heather.
Yes, totally agree. It's a big frustration. We see the same photos being used over and over again. We're trying to address it by making more photos available, so commissioning photos directly ourselves, particularly photos with people in it, because that's another thing that we're always missing. We want to see people enjoying the landscape. So all of those are fed into Resource Space, which is our photo library, and that's available to businesses to use for so particularly their brand holders. We signpost them to there to get some of that content and imagery that isn't just the same old thing. A bit of a shout out on that note would be that we can also take input from other places. So if you know a local organisation that has a photo bank and they're willing for those to be shared as well, feed them in. So Grant Initiative approached us recently to say that they had just done some photography. So again, we can feed that in and make it more available, just so that there's a bigger pool of more diverse photos.
Thank you. Steve Micklewright, followed by Sandra McDade and Lauren McCallum. Steve.
Yeah, thanks. I remember to switch this thing on this time, so that's good. Just a point about reducing seasonality, really, because I think that has so many benefits if we can get there for businesses and employment. So the campaign is great. Are there any other things that we can be doing or can be thinking about on reducing seasonality in the longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, winter is the focus, and there's been a lot of work in other areas to try to extend the summer season as well. So looking at shoulder month. So obviously we do a bit of that work as well. Again, that comes down to things as simple as photos. So even if you are using Loch Morlich, why not have it covered in snow rather than people sunbathing on a sunny day? Winter is still the quietest time. I mean, we're very lucky that we have a winter season at all, because compared to most of the Highlands, I mean, lots of places effectively close up for the winter. So we have that as an asset, despite the perception that in some ways we are a winter destination. All the evidence shows that that is still when our visitor numbers are lowest. So that will still be the focus. So the winter campaign is coming to a close at the end of next week. We'll be doing a bit of an assessment on that. Partly in terms of sort of all the digital stats on reach and engagement, but also following that work up with businesses who've been involved as well, because what we really want is to see them feeling that it's making a difference to the number of particularly overnight stays and short breaks. Ideally, what I'd like is for that to be a campaign that continues to run, possibly spreads out to cover into the autumn as well, event-driven, product-driven by businesses. So what we're really hoping is there's been enough of its success this year while we've been pushing it, that businesses slightly take hold of it and run with it and develop that further into future years.
Thank you. Sandra's points being covered. Lauren Callum.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I just on the sort of the levy, I think most of us in the conversations that we've had in our community is that tourism feels like something that's done to us than something that we get to, you know, evolve and shape and actually benefit from. And I think, and that's where you get that conflict of user, conflict of local versus tourist, that sort of, you know, sometimes that frustrating relationship that arises. I think I would really like the park to try and use its influence as much. So to use that visitor levy, or to encourage the councils to use that visitor levy, so that the communities can get a bigger slice of that tourism pie. So it's something that we get to shape and we get to benefit. I think it would be a loss for you know, for it not to be able to sort of deliver the service communities, you know, desperately want to see. I know outside the park, you know, obviously the effect of not having the ranger service, I think, is going to be very challenging this summer. I think that's quite scary, actually. But yeah, in terms of the conversations that I've been having with our communities, using that tourism levy so that our communities can have a bigger slice of the tourism pie, and it be seen as a collaborative thing instead of something that's just done.
Thank you, Lon. Sander.
Yeah, thanks. I think just to pick up on that point, Lauren, it is something that is concerning businesses and the communities about how's the money going to be spent, and that's been part of the discussion from day one. And this is not a particularly new discussion; it's been going on for quite a while. And I think probably what you will see is that where councils do choose to implement it and they've got, as money says, to spend it on certain things, it will be things like services, etc. And what that also does is it takes off pressure from other services that the community will benefit from. So it does take a bit of financial pressure. And also, if I can just come back to Anne's earlier question around it as well, yes, we might see different decisions taken around the park, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing for all of those communities. And I'm going to pick on Moray Council here as an example, Derek, so don't be offended. Let's say Highland does introduce one, but Moray doesn't introduce one. Moray might choose not to introduce one to try and incentivise more visitors to come to Moray because they can take those extra visitor numbers in the same way that different authorities have different parking charges. If you go to the Borders, it's free to park, and my parents when they had a camper van thought that was fantastic that you could go and stop off there on their way south and park for free. Whereas in Perth and Kinross, you know, every time the budget comes round, we want to jack up the amount of money because we're desperately needing to fund services. So you know, different authorities will make different decisions, but actually I think the approach that we're getting towards, and I'm not going to say we're there yet with all of the detail, but it has been a long process, and part of that's because of a lot of the complexities within it. And obviously, as Russell mentioned earlier, we haven't quite got there yet with whether the camper van question is answered. I think my concern possibly about introducing it on camper vans is it encourages them perhaps to find ways not to stay responsibly, and how you collect that, etc. And actually, if we lived in a country with a better tax system, you would collect that through road tax and distribute it out in that format to places that are experiencing pressures and demands. But that's a perfect world, and we don't live in that. So you know, we're not there with all of the parts of the answers yet, but it is getting closer to a point where I think the outcome will mean the best balance for councils, communities, and that bit where the national park is having a say is now included in there and is an important part of the equation.
Thank you, Sandra. Bill Loddon.
Thanks, Camilla. Oh, Lauren, it does actually depend, you know, as the final outcome of the bill, what the bill actually says in the end. But it is likely that local authorities will then have to decide what is tourism, or what benefits there are to tourism, what infrastructure you could possibly consider as being tourism related. Arclets, for example, a tourism infrastructure is a decently paved road, tourism infrastructure. That will be a decision that councils will have to make throughout their entire area, and will obviously consult with the national park at the time regarding spend in their particular area. If an individual council takes a TVL forward, which in Highland you can almost guarantee that we will take it forward. So in general, as far as infrastructure is concerned, this is a game changer for the people of the Highlands. So don't automatically think that this is going to go on flower pots and hanging baskets, because it isn't.
Briefly, yep.
Yeah, no, I get that, Bill. But my point was just so that we can influence to make sure that this is a game changer. And my point was just so that we can use our influence to make sure that game changing opportunity. That was all.
And briefly, Grant.
Yeah, no, my point was just going to say that I think we've always just got to remember that I mean, tourism is a massive industry within the Cairngorms National Park. I mean, I think it's the 2022 STEAM figures, but it's 353 million was generated directly and indirectly within the local economy through visitor and tourism business expenditure in that year. This is the amount of people who are employed within the national park, directly or indirectly in tourism, is the vast majority of people within the national park. It is a key industry, and the bit around the visitor levy, I suppose, is how can we make sure we support the right infrastructure to support that amount of people coming into an area who are spending money within the area, who are creating jobs within the area, and how we can support that best over the long term. And I think the key thing about the visitor levy is that you will roughly know what you've got for a number of years. You will know where it's, and you can plan for the longer term, which I think is one of the key benefits of a tax type thing, and that you know where you're going, and of course you can borrow against it as well, which potentially allows you to then open up opportunities for bigger projects and things that are game changing, which is, I think, the key bit about this. It is not about the small things, it's about trying to do what are the big things that will make the vast difference, which will keep more of the money within the Highlands, that will keep more of the jobs within the Highlands, that will result in better paid jobs, etc. within that as well. So I think that's the long-term benefit of it all.
Thanks. It is massive, and yeah, big decisions ahead. Barry.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up Lauren's points about the importance of keeping communities involved in tourism management and being supportive of tourism. I mean, I think in a way the COVID period absolutely demonstrated to everyone what the impact is if you don't have visitors, or if visitors come in a sudden rush all at one time. So we've seen that very acutely over the last few years. The Europark principles that underpin the charter work are very much about the social side of sustainability as well as the environmental side. So for that reason, the tourism partnership that Xander chairs has got community representatives sitting on it. Karen Derrick from Voluntary Action Badenoch and Strathspey, for example, sits on it. You may remember that as the lockdown periods were released, there was a degree of tension at community level about, do we want visitors back? Some people were asking, and we worked with the Cairngorms Business Partnership then to have a Cairngorms Together initiative, which was quite impactful at the time, and it did create that sentiment of we're all working together and we want to work. And just briefly, I'll see if I can weave in a reference to the community action planning work, because in Aviemore this weekend, today and this weekend, there's some quite important events happening to help people in Aviemore chart out what they want to do over the next few years, and being such an important settlement in the park, a big part of what they want to do is about tourism. So if you have any friends or contacts or time, please try and get along to those events this coming days.
Thank you, Murray. And there being no further questions or comments, is the board content to note progress in delivery of the Sustainable Tourism Action Plan 2022 to 27? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Heather. And thank you very much, Murray. Don't go away. Moving on to item 9, paper 5, minutes from committee meetings. They're for information, introduced by David Cameron, Director of Corporate Services and Deputy CEO. David.
For information, convener, we'll pick up any questions if there are any.
Are there any questions? There are none. Is the board is asked to note the minutes of the Governance and Resources Committee, note the draft minutes of the Audit and Risk Committee, Performance and Resources Committee. Happy, content. Thank you very much. Item 10, AOCB, we have nothing notified. None, thank you. Item 11, date of the next formal board meeting, the 22nd of June, when I'm delighted to say that we'll be convening at Blair Athol. Sorry. 28th. Yeah.
Check.
Yeah, it's 28. Yeah.
It is 28. Stand corrected. Well,
20 seconds of Saturday.
we're definitely not meeting at Blairth on a Saturday. We'll now end the live stream, but I'd ask members please to wait for a moment.
That's in mind as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're all